Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. Today, we are joined by two influential defense thinkers in Congress who are going to talk about the challenges facing the U.S. Maritime Industrial Base. This discussion is very salient right now. The SHIPYARD Act, which was recently introduced by these two congressmen as well as some co-sponsors, is currently making its way through the congressional consideration process. At the same time as we have the Biden administration building support behind an infrastructure plan that might or might not include the shipbuilding and ship repair industrial base. Our guests today are Congressman Rob Wittman from Virginia's 1st Congressional District. He's been in Congress since 2007. He is the vice-ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. He also sits on the Sea Power and Projection Forces Committee, where he's the ranking member, and on the Tactical Air and Land Forces Committee, where he's a member. He's also on the House Committee for Natural Resources, as well as the co-chair of the Congressional Shipbuilding Caucus, which is relevant to today's discussion. Prior to being in Congress, Congressman Wittman also served in the Virginia House of Delegates. We're also joined by Congressman Mike Gallagher from the 8th District in Wisconsin. Congressman Gallagher is a member of the House Armed Services Committee as well. He is the ranking member on the Personnel Subcommittee, as well as sitting on the Sea Power and Power Projection Forces Subcommittee. He's also a member of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and sits on several subcommittees there. Prior to coming to Congress, Congressman Gallagher was an active duty Marine, served as a counterintelligence and human intelligence officer, as well as a regional affairs officer, deployed twice to Al Anbar province in Iraq during the war there as a commander of intelligence teams. And he served up to the rank of captain before he entered into Congress. We want to thank both of you for being here, Congressman, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian.
Great to be with you. Good to be with you. So to start off the conversation, I thought maybe we could kind of open it up with the bigger competition that's underway right now between the United States and China. The Biden administration, in putting out its initial proposal for the infrastructure bill that's currently being considered by Congress, the American Jobs Plan, cited the competition with China as one of the reasons behind that effort. The competition with China, when you take it down to the military competition, is not going well for the United States. We've arguably fallen behind in several mission areas, one of those being naval forces. China has been very aggressively building its shipbuilding industry, has been expanding it, and is building a wide variety of ships at a rapid pace. Meanwhile, the U.S. shipbuilding industry has consolidated over the last 20 to 30 years. Even though we've got a little bit over 100 shipyards today in the U.S., only about 20 are able to build larger vessels that could be used for military or Coast Guard purposes. Of those 20, we've only got 7 that devote themselves entirely to building just Navy ships. And even a couple of those are, or at least one of those is in peril as we go into this next shipbuilding plan, because it might not get any future ships. And as a result, might have to think about another line of work. Our shipbuilding base is contracting. China's is growing. On the repair side, we've got challenges as well that we will discuss today. Yeah, first of all, to talk about this in terms of the China competition, yeah, how are we faring with regard to this overall competition with China, and how is our shipbuilding and repair, our maritime industrial base, performing as a component of that competition? So first, Congressman Wittman, what do you think?
Well, listen, I believe that our industrial base, for the capacity that's there, is performing extraordinarily well. The problem is we just don't have enough of that capacity. If you look at the plan for shipbuilding, the 2021 shipbuilding plan that was just unveiled, it is absolutely insufficient. The president's budget request is insufficient. You can't do addition by subtraction. We will not be able to keep up with the efforts of the Chinese in building their Navy, which, by the way, now has more ships than our Navy, and those ships are very capable ships. The president's budget this year proposes to build 8 ships. 2 of those are tugboats, proposes to retire 15 ships. 7 of those are cruisers. Think about this. The vertical launch system capability in those cruisers is equivalent to the entire British Navy. So we see what capacity we're losing. I'm not a mathematician, but it's hard for me to see how you do addition by subtraction. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs says we need to have a much larger fleet, and in order to have dominant capability over China and any other adversary, that is quintessential to this nation. This budget doesn't do that. So we are running counter to what the chairman of our Joint Chiefs says that we need to have. And we don't have the capacity either to keep up with Chinese capacity to maintain those ships. So it's not just about building those ships, but it's about maintaining those ships. We are far behind China in the trajectory for building our Navy. We're behind China in the shipyard infrastructure that we need. And we are well behind in what this year's budget proposes in what we need to do on a trajectory to build our Navy to get anywhere close to being able to compete with the pacing threat of China.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the Chinese are building their fleet up at the rate of 10 new ships per year. So it's growing at a rate of 10 per year. Folks argue that the ships are not built as well. I've seen some Chinese ships, and that might be true, but with the amount of ship repair capacity they have, that may not be an issue because they can probably get those ships back in the field more quickly than we could ever could. Congressman Gallagher, turning to you, what do you think we are with regard to the competition of China, and particularly the maritime industrial aspect of it?
Well, I agree with everything that Rob Wittman said. It's always an honor to be with him, though it's intimidating because he's forgotten more about sea power than I will ever know. And to the extent I've achieved anything in my 5 years in Congress, it's just because I'm Wittman's wingman. I just follow him around and I sort of echo what he says. But what I find interesting is that we now have public testimony from not just Admiral Davidson, former commander of Indo-PACOM, but also reaffirmed by the CNO and the commandant last week, warning us that the PLA could make a move on Taiwan within the next six years. So what I've called the Davidson window is closing every day. And we have plans that project out to build a battle force in 2045. We have 30-year shipbuilding plans, or maybe we do. We don't get them from the administration in violation of U.S. law. When we really need to be thinking more immediately in terms of what we can do prior to 2025 in order to deter that most stressing case of a fait accompli strategy against Taiwan. And that may seem like a dark future, but it's one that I believe is heading our way sooner rather than later if we fail to act. And just building on a lot of what Rob said, I mean, since 2005, the PLA Navy has grown its battle force by 117 ships. And over the same period, the U.S. Navy battle force has grown by 5. That is not the right trend line. And I always remember in my freshman term when I went out to one of our master repair yards for ships out on the West Coast in San Diego, and they were telling me about a dry dock that they'd recently built and invested millions of dollars in. And, as part of this sort of expected pivot to the Pacific, they'll be deploying more Navy ships out there. And they would need more repairs. And I said, well, where'd you build it? And he said, well, we built it in China. And we had to cut it into 3 pieces and ship it back across the Pacific. So a lot of just the critical infrastructure we need to repair our ships is being built by our enemy, which is crazy. And I think the biggest takeaway from the pandemic is going to be all of us sort of waking up to the critical vulnerabilities in our supply chain and a lot of the single points of failure that affect our supply chain, and engage in this good faith effort to onshore and nearshore. But we got a long, long way to go.
Yeah, it's always surprising to the degree to which even our military systems depend on Chinese supply chain elements, or indirectly on the Chinese, which they're more than happy to supply. I assume they're more than happy to get inside of our military industrial base, as well as be able to make the money off of it. It seems like part of, I think, what seems to be happening with the Chinese too is a messaging campaign. I mean, they're using the expansion of their fleet, they're using the expansion of its capability also as a way to intimidate, arguably, their neighbors, their potential adversaries, particularly in their near abroad. It seems like that has been relatively successful of late. In getting folks in that region to start reevaluating their alliances with the United States or their potential dependence on the United States. Are you seeing any of that, Congressman Gallagher? And then I'll turn to you, Congressman Wittman.
Well, it's interesting to me in April of last year, when I, like many of you, was trapped in my basement because Congress had disbanded and we weren't going anywhere because of the pandemic. I took the time to watch Wolf Warrior 1 and Wolf Warrior 2, which are available on YouTube, highest grossing Chinese movies of all time, or at least Wolf Warrior 2 is. And it's easy to dismiss that. And these are the movies that have given life to the so-called Wolf Warrior diplomacy, where Xi has dispatched all his diplomats, primarily on American social media, to spread dangerous propaganda and jingoistic rhetoric. It's easy to dismiss it as just sort of ham-handed over the top, but they have a huge following, not just domestically, but regionally. And more to the point, their audience is an audience of one. It's Xi Jinping himself, who has consolidated all of the power. And so I don't know. My own view is that Xi views the effectuation of unification of Taiwan with the mainland as a legacy issue. I don't know if he's going to do something foolish in the next 5 years, but I think we have to plan as if he's going to. And if he's looking around the world, he probably sees, hey, Russia got away with invading a country. The Americans seem pretty divided politically right now. And then we have a lot of bills that are coming due in terms of we have to pay for on the defense side. So maybe this decade would be a good time to test the limits. And you sort of have to assume that and plan accordingly.
Yeah, and Congressman Wittman, that gets back to your point about decommissionings and kind of how the Navy seems to be, at least in this current budget, I guess previous budgets as well, but most importantly in this FY22 budget, focused on the future. They are looking to put R&D towards future classes of ships at the expense of procurement today and at the expense of current ships and their O&S expenses. So they're trying to offload those expenses and shift that money to buying the next generation of technologies. But those technologies may not show up until after this decade is over and the window that we're talking about here is past. Are you concerned that that's an element of this, is that the Chinese might be actually operating within a much tighter window than we might have been planning for?
Well, Bryan, let me begin by pointing out that my colleague is also tremendously well-versed in the issues involving sea power and all the issues on the House Armed Services Committee, extraordinarily bright and talented. And I tell folks, I appreciate his kind comments towards me, but my goal in life is to grow up and be like Mike Gallagher. So anyway, but along those lines, as far as where China's going, where we are on that path, China's on an extraordinarily aggressive path to build capability. And their focus is to have a naval force that can sustain operations worldwide. It used to be you'd look at them as a regional force. That's not on the track that they're on. And listen, their ships, while they have more ships than we have, their newer ships coming online are extraordinarily capable. And even our leaders in the Marine Corps, in the Navy, and even General Milley have stated that the capability in China is growing and is of issue in relation to United States capability. As they continue to grow their force, as Representative Gallagher pointed out, the pathway that they are on in the number of ships that they have built and are on track to build is at a much, much higher rate than the track that the United States is on, whether it's historically or what is proposed in this year's budget. And while certainly our ships have great capability, quantity has a quality all its own. And my concern is that it is not in the too distant future that we will see this delta of difference in capability and capacity in the United States and China continue to grow. And listen, China is opportunistic, and think about the calculus that they go through in looking at when they could attempt to take Taiwan back. Admiral Davidson pointed this out. He believes that window is going to be much sooner than later. As we continue on this path, we sent a clear message to China with only building 8 ships, 2 of which are tugboats, and retiring 15, that we're on the path of reducing the size and capability of our Navy. And the whole idea that somehow we're going to take those savings, which remember in these ship retirements occur over years, and somehow immediately get replacement capability is a fallacy. That replacement capability doesn't even occur within the future year's defense plan, the fit up as it's known. That's way out in the future. So we give up capability today for some future promise in the future. Bryan, I argue that all the dreams of the United States in military capability are now occurring outside the fit up. which is pretty alarming as to where we are. China looks at that. I think it opens up their window. If they see an opportunity, believe me, with as aggressive as Xi Jinping is, I believe that they will take that opportunity because they aren't sure what happens after that. But if they see that opportunity with the broadening delta between U.S. naval capability and Chinese naval capability, I believe they will take that opportunity.
It's a great point, and it totally inverts a lot of the planning assumptions the Navy, I think, has been working around, which is it's a 30-year plan. We're going to build for the future. When we did the FNFS last year, we were looking at a 2045 to 2050 timeframe. That all probably needs to go out the window, and we probably need to start thinking much more about what does the Navy look like in 2030, and invest in a way that allows us to have that capability maximized, and then maybe accept risk in the future, which is the opposite of what I think the Navy has been doing. In your discussions with the Navy, does it appear that they are starting to get that message, or is this being driven by external forces, the administration trying to come up with a way to save money, or do you think this is legitimately a future-focused effort that they think is the right answer?
Well, I'll start, then I want to turn over to my colleague, Mr. Gallagher. I believe that we are in, unfortunately, a familiar place, and that is budgets driving strategy. And the strategy needs to be driven by the threats that we face and what we need to do to maintain our position in the world as a strategic leader. And once you yield that space, it is extraordinarily difficult to get it back. And if you aren't on a trajectory to make the necessary investments each year to build that capability, to modernize, to build the capacity, you can't just skip a year. And listen, this isn't unique to this administration. We've seen it in the past administration where it's taken a little bit of time for them to figure out, hey, naval power is the key to the future, especially in the Indo-Pacific. You can't afford to skip a year, because even if you say, well, we're going to mark time this year and then next year we'll pick up the pace, you never get that year back. You never get that time back in the ships that China's built, and now the additional ones that the U.S. attempts to build, because the industrial base is limited in capacity. There's a limited amount of dollars that you can actually operationalize in a budget unless you make massive increases. And I argue, even if you make massive increases, which is not likely, but even if you make massive increases, there's not the capacity in the industrial base to do that. So that's why a steady path of continuing to build ships, more ships than what you retire each year, and you have the capacity to maintain those ships, is the way that you sustain a Navy capable of deterring the Chinese.
I agree with Representative Wittman. It's sort of like Navy Groundhog Day, right? We've seen this play out time and time again, and it's always some promise of a future capability or some magical third offset thinking that's going to solve all of our problems. And it's particularly egregious now because at the same time, in my opinion, the Biden budget overall is proposing to spend more in real terms than we did during World War II, largely for domestic progressive priorities. They're unwilling to spend the minimum necessary to prevent World War III. And then I think they're both in the executive and legislative branch, there's an unwillingness to make what I consider a few fundamental hard budgetary choices. Potentially one being breaking the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split between the services, recognizing the paramount importance of integrated American sea power based on just looking at the map of Indo-PACOM. And then two, sharing the bill for Colombia are two that stand out in my mind. The one area I think that gives me a little bit of optimism, where I think we're thinking a little bit creatively, particularly with a shorter time frame in mind and in a genuine attempt to deter a PLA invasion by denial, is with the Commandant of the Marine Corps and his force design and some of the innovative ideas he's put out there, particularly the use of long-range fires. My view is we have a huge opportunity now that we're no longer bound by the strictures of the INF Treaty to use long-range fires and INF non-compliant missiles to hold their ships at risk at low cost, really sort of flipping the anti-access aerial denial script against the PLA Navy. And that to me is the key for getting creative in the short term. At the same time, we continue to fund our long-term priorities.
Yeah, I think it raises a great point about how we need to be focused on China as the main competitor and as the forcing function for a lot of our decision making. And I think we still see a lot of examples in the budget where we're buying things that are maybe not designed in a way that is optimized for the China threat. And I think with the force design, though, the commandant has really embraced it and said, this is our main problem. Let's make sure that our force reflects the challenges of that main problem and isn't trying to be necessarily the Swiss Army knife for every possible situation. Which is so you're going to some specifics now. You've both mentioned, Congressman Wittman mentioned in particular, the need for a steady growth in the size of the fleet and in the capability of the fleet. And instead of this sort of divest to invest approach that the administration's reflecting in its current budget. Right now, if you look at that budget, we're going to try to increase the production of submarines, but on the surface combatant side and on the amphibious side, we're taking reductions and we're going to, in some cases, stop building ship classes that are currently in production, like the LPD Flight 2. Congressman Wittman, what do you think that what are the challenges involved then for the shipbuilding industrial base and our ability to get the future capability that the administration argues they think they need? When we stop production of current classes of ships in the hopes of coming up with something better later, it seems like it's not going to be there's going to be this gap, and that we're not going to get back the industrial capacity we're going to lose.
Well, Bryan, let me build on what Representative Gallagher talked about. He's spot on when he talks about the path that the Marines are on. The Commandant has the exact pathway, I believe, to make sure that we can counter Chinese efforts in the Indo-Pacific. One of the things that's critical of that is the current block buy that is in OSD Cape to purchase 1 LHD and 3 LPD Flight 2s. That is critically important to execute that contract because multiple buys assures that the Marine Corps will be on track to have the ships that they need. The 2021 shipbuilding plan has them from 24 to 26 amphibs. The Commandant has said 31 needs to be the floor. I think it puts them at unnecessary risk. And the Commandant said that the other day in the posture hearing. So I think those things are incredibly important. We need to do everything we can to get OSD Cape to execute that particular contract, because short of that, the Marine Corps will not have the capability they need to move, to be mobile and agile, to move around the Pacific. The light amphibious warfare vessel, better known as LAWS, is an incredibly important part of that, to be distributed across the Pacific, to be able to move, to be able to create uncertainty for the Chinese. Those things are incredibly important as to the future path for the Navy Marine Corps team and what it does in the Pacific to hold the Chinese at risk. Long-range precision fires are key. Long-range anti-ship missiles are the key. And that's a way for us to, in addition to having the warship capability there, especially surface fleet capability, is to have that to create uncertainty there. The investment in that has to occur quickly. We have to get those assets online, and not executing that 4-ship buy for amphibious ships, I think, creates unacceptable risk for the Navy Marine Corps team. And the Commandant said as much the other day at our hearing.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say, you asked about some of the roadblocks. Well, I think back, I came into Congress in 2017, and Bryan, at that time, you were participating in one of the 3 different naval force structure reviews that were conducted by CSBA, MITRE, and the Navy. And all the reviews differed on the specifics, but they were aligned in one critical area, which is the idea that we needed a bigger fleet ASAP. Right. But over the course of 2018 and 2019, and despite the fact that then Chairman Wittman had, made getting to 355 as soon as practically possible a matter of U.S. law, the Navy kept pushing back its timeline for delivering a post-NDS force structure assessment. Right. Secretary Esper comes in, he takes over the process and ultimately produces Battle Force 2045, but we didn't have it fully in hand until December 2020. And now the Biden Pentagon is saying that we have to go back to the drawing board. So what's the biggest roadblock? It's that lack of consistent leadership. It's that we don't have that layman-like figure sort of evangelizing for integrated American sea power with the support of the president, which is what you need. Otherwise, the status quo, I think, is going to win out in the building and on Capitol Hill. Right.
We have a Secretary of the Navy nominee with Del Toro coming in potentially. The challenge, as you note, is going to be, does that chair or does that secretary have the support of the president? You know, because John Lehman, arguably, when he was advocating for the 600 ship Navy, was doing it because the president was behind him all the way and was going to make those resources available. And it sounds like what Secretary Del Toro will face is going to be a situation where he's having to make the best of a situation where he's been given a budget constraint that he has to operate within and make the best of it. So going back to the question of amphibs, the one thing I want to ask you, Congressman Gallagher, also was this new force design that the Marine Corps is describing. Congressman Wittman brought up the light amphibious warship, obviously as a big component of moving Marines around littoral environments. It seems like if we're going to equip them and support them properly, then we need these amphibs in order to provide the backup. And then also, do we need to think about how do we equip amphibious ships differently for the China context than we might have equipped them in the past? And then the last thing is, it seems also like what the Commandant's saying is, if we're going to focus on China with most of the military, somebody has to be available to do the other things that come up. You know, so when something happens in the Middle East, when something happens in South Asia or Africa, who's going to be called upon to do that is probably the Marine Corps. So it seems like amphibious ships will be the mechanism that gets them there in numbers. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of people will want to walk away from the amphibs as an element of the fleet. It seems like there's arguments for why we need to keep them both in the China context and in for these other situations.
Well, I've certainly been persuaded by those arguments. And I think Representative Wittman hit the nail on the head when he talked about that 31 floor. I think it's essential to implementing the Commandant's force design, as well as covering down on some other missions as they arrive. And, you know, one thing that strikes me is that while on the surface, these changes might seem revolutionary, you know, I'd argue that they're facilitating a very old and familiar concept of operations. I mean, just look at the role that the Marine Corps played at the defense of islands like Wake early on in the war, where we had land-based aviation and coastal artillery that just punched well above their weight against Japanese invasion forces. And so I think that the Marine Corps is taking a historically informed approach to its future. And it's something that navalists like myself and Representative Wittman need to be supportive of going forward and push back on some of the arguments that we're hearing on the other side.
Yeah, so Congressman Wittman, one of the challenges with growing the fleet has been obviously the support of the administration. What are some of the other roadblocks that you've seen come up? Because there's been no, as Congressman Gallagher said, no lack of analysis arguing for a larger fleet. You know, I did two different studies, both of which argued for a bigger fleet in a lot of the same ways. What do you think the things are that are holding us back?
Well, you point out this administration and previous administrations too, in their hesitancy to move forward on the right pace. Another thing that sometimes doesn't get mentioned, but I think is also critically important, and that is the industrial base. Because the industrial base right now is what I believe at an absolute minimum. And the challenge is allowing yards to survive as we change platforms. A great example are some of the shipyards down in the Gulf, like Austin and others. We need those yards. We need that capacity. You cannot afford to lose those yards. So the question is, if you're going to be reducing the number of ships that you build, how do you sustain an industrial base? Not just the physical facilities, but also the manpower. We need shipbuilders that are experts at welding, at sheet metal, at electrician work. All those elements have to be remembered in this. And we also have to make sure that these yards see a future where they're willing to invest in their yards, or where they're willing to modernize their yards, where they're willing to make sure their yards are more productive. Because I argue in the future, Bryan, it's not just about building that capability, but the strategic competition in the future will be, can we get more out of our dollar than the Chinese get per their yuan or the Russians get per their ruble? Because we are not going to have unlimited resources. As Representative Gallagher pointed out, we have a record amount of debt in this nation, approaching 100% of GDP. That is going to impede the number of dollars that we can spend. So I've encouraged everybody across the board is, you know, we have to do more with the dollars that we put out there. And I know it's an overused phrase to say do more with less, but on the current track, we're going to do less with less unless things change. I think we have to properly resource things, but we also have to find creative and innovative ways to be able to do more. The commandant, I think, is looking at that. How do we take the forces we have? How do we distribute them? How do we make them more lethal? How do we do that within the context of the limited amount of resources? But let me tell you, if you're going to go down to 24 amphibious ships, you will do less with less. You will increase the risk for the Marines that are out there. You will increase the risk for the sailors that are out there trying to prosecute this mission across the Indo-Pacific. There's just no two ways about it.
Right, and that also raises shrinking the size of the fleet also means you're going to be working it harder. So that means you're going to be increasing the risk on the backside for the material condition and the training proficiency and then everything that goes into readiness of the fleet. So you're incurring a cost on the back end because you're going to end up with ships, as we've seen with the carrier fleet today, where they're unable to deploy when the time comes, and we're having to move ships around and gate the strategic risk of losing the coverage as we are with the Ronald Reagan. Congressman Gallagher, we've talked about personnel as an element of this. The current economic environment or the employment environment is such that when shipbuilders or ship repair yards lose somebody, they may not get them back because they may decide to go into a different line of work because there's lots of jobs out there. How do we need to think about growing the shipyard workforce, because all the shipyards are arguing they don't have enough people, and also try to retain those folks, even if we're not going to have necessarily the steadiest of shipbuilding plans going forward? Are there ways that we can try to maximize the utilization and the reliability of that employment?
Well, this is the biggest economic issue in Wisconsin. I'm sure the picture is similar in Virginia. It was the biggest issue prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic has exacerbated it. You talk to any business, not just, Fink and Terry in my district and shipbuilders or Oshkosh, but, a restaurant, whatever, small, medium, large business, and they'll tell you, we can't find workers, right? We'll have 10 people show up for the job, 2 people pass the drug test and only 1 will show up to work. I mean, that's, there's some immediate things we can do. In my opinion, ending the unemployment plus up, which is a clear disincentive to work, would be a good idea. I proposed repurposing it to a reemployment bonus where you give people money if they keep a job for more than 4 weeks. But it is a bigger issue than that. It's an issue that's going to involve a cultural change in our K through 12 system. We've paid a lot of lip service to the idea that, in my district, you don't need to go to a 4-year UW university. You can go right to NWTC, learn to weld. NWTC has a creative partnership with the shipyard. Within a year, 2 years, you're making a ton of money building something really cool for the US Navy. And a lot of people pay lip service to that. But then when I ask parents about it, I say, well, what are your kids doing? And they say, well, my kid's going to a 4-year university. So part of it involves the cultural stigma around going right into the workforce. One thing that happened in my district, I'm sorry to go on, I'll end after this, that I thought was really cool and an indication of where we need to go is at one of the pipe fitting union, which does work with my shipyard, they had an apprenticeship signing day. So for all the kids that were starting their apprenticeship path, they kind of had a ceremony like, the star athlete at your high school when they would sign with a big university, and all of us were there. And that to me was just a great idea. And I think is an indication of how we get kids into the workforce and potentially into the shipbuilding industrial base, because it's a huge, huge problem. We also need people to have more kids. I don't know how to incentivize that at a federal level. I'll stop. My Catholic sensibilities might bleed through, but we got a demographic problem, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I know the SHIPYARD Act's really going to be able to cover that. Right. There might be a side element of the act. But in terms of the SHIPYARD Act, I mean, to talk about that, Congressman Wittman, one of the elements that the administration has talked about in the American Jobs Plan is retraining, preparing folks for the future economy and jobs that are going to be in demand in the future. We do have a very tight employment environment today, which means jobs are going to have to probably pay more in order to get people to come and stay there and be able to retain them. Can we do more when it comes to the shipbuilding and ship repair industry to try to give them better training capacity, give them more attractive training pipelines, and make those jobs more attractive to folks to come into? Because that seems like that's something that the American Jobs Plan, even though it doesn't currently address it, should be addressing, and that maybe be an opportunity for the SHIPYARD Act to provide some of that support.
Absolutely, Brian. Well, listen, there are a number of things we can do. One is to make sure that we adjust where dollars are available to students to do other than a 2 or 4 year degree, just as Representative Gallagher pointed out. I have a bill in called the Propel Act that allows the largest source of funds for students, that is Pell Grants, to be used for other than 2- and 4-year degree pursuits. So if you're going to need to go get a certification or credential, you ought to be able to use the Pell Grants. Additionally, states have 529 savings plans where you can take money tax-free and save it for tuition for your child. What I want to make sure is we expand that to allow it to be used for certifications and credentials. I want to make sure we're incentivizing folks to go into the career and technical education path. That is critical. What can we do through the SHIPYARD Act is this. We can make sure we modernize our yards, because especially our public yards are so antiquated. The dry docks are so old that I believe they are soon going to pose safety hazards. Second of all, if you go to those yards, you see how old they are. I mean, these are circa World War II yards, where you go there and you go, wow, I feel like I've stepped back in time. And if you look at competing for workers and retaining workers, and they can go to an old antiquated shipyard where they have to walk thousands of feet to go back and forth between a shop and the ship they're working on, and they can go to a private sector yard where things are much more modern, we know where they're going to end up. And now you have to compete for that skill set with other parts of industries that need welders, that need electricians, that need sheet metal workers, and they're working in modern facilities that are bright and clean and conditioned. I can tell you, it makes it impossible to compete for those workers. So modernizing the facilities, making sure that we make resources available for those folks that may want to either change track or come out of high school and get trained in those career tracks. And as Representative Gallagher pointed out, let me tell you, these are extraordinarily successful career tracks. If you are a journeyman, or for that matter, a master shipbuilder, you know, you're making in the upper 5 figures, sometimes lower 6 figures, which is much more than you could make with the degree with an oversupply of graduates in certain areas. So, you know, we ought to be highlighting that, and parents need to understand that too. I think a lot of times they think, oh, I don't want my kid to go into a career and technical education field because it's dirty and it's low paying. No, these are high paying jobs, and they are in areas where if we modernize the shipbuilding industry, I can tell you, when I grew up in that area of Virginia, the Newport News Apprentice School was on the equivalent of any college in the area. They had a tremendous athletics program there where folks would go there and go to school. They participated in world-class athletics, and they would get a certification there to go to work in the yard. And those folks are working there now 40 years plus later as master shipbuilders. We can do this, but we've got to make sure we reemphasize the importance of career and technical education.
That's a fantastic point. And the modernizing of the shipyards, I think, is a terrific point too. So Congressman Gallagher, the SHIPYARD Act puts $20 billion towards, or $21 billion towards the SIOP, the shipyard improvement, the shipyard infrastructure optimization plan that the Navy has. There's been some discussion from Congressman Garamendi and others about making that a shorter time window instead of doing it over 20 years, giving the Navy 5 years worth of money to go do that. That seems like that's not really the right answer, just because it takes a long time to upgrade a shipyard, especially if you're using it. Are we putting enough money in the SHIPYARD Act towards the public shipyards, one? And then are we going to have to rethink how that money is distributed over time, because you're going to have to, you know, you're simultaneously upgrading the shipyard while you're still using it to do repair work?
Well, you know, I think $21 billion is a good start. I'm old enough to remember when that was a big sum of money compared to what we're throwing around these days. But of course, it's something that we'll have to evaluate, particularly in light of what is another priority in the bill, which is to invest in the construction of new commercial shipyards, right? So we got $2 billion to help subsidize key upgrades and modernization projects on the commercial side, and full use of the Defense Production Act, Title III authorities to support production, protection, or restoration of critical infrastructure. So, you know, I view this as the opening act in a much larger discussion. I very much hope it will be part of an infrastructure bill. But again, I think we're trapped in the fundamental problem of the infrastructure discussion on the Hill, which is that we are just blowing the lids off the place when it comes to all sorts of domestic progressive priorities, while failing to focus on what is absolutely essential, like our shipyards. And imagine if we had sort of a public campaign around how important, you know, the Navy is to our defense, how important the shipbuilding industry is. I think that would go a long way towards solving the problem that Representative Wittman laid out, right? You'd start to connect the dots with the next generation that not only are you going to make a lot of money, but you're serving your country by building warships, right? You're helping that, Lance Corporal, or whatever, accomplish the mission and come home safe, right? That's a patriotic endeavor. So there's a PR element of this that I think is missing as well.
Yeah, and the Shipyard Act has in some ways kind of flown below the radar because it is relatively small compared to the trillions of dollars we're talking about in the overall infrastructure plan. So Congressman Wittman, one of the issues I think that's come up in the course of the discussion about the Shipyard Act, or the SIOP too, is the fact that we're starting to rely now on the private ship repair industry to do some of the work that the public ship repair yards have done previously. So nuclear repair work on submarines and aircraft carriers. So those are being picked up increasingly to the surge volume over at places like Huntington Ingalls and at General Dynamics. And we also currently rely completely on the private ship repair facilities for our surface vessels, including the amphibious fleet. So there's a huge need over there for them to get the kind of support that allows them to sustain the level of production that they need to keep the fleet going, especially as ships become more complex, the repair work becomes more challenging, and takes longer time, more man hours. What do you think we need to do to be able to support those private yards, both in picking up the load from the public yards, especially if the public yards are being upgraded and need a place to offload their work, and also those private yards that support the surface and amphibious fleets?
Well, Brian, we are absolutely going to need the private yards in any scenario, but especially as I believe, need to get on the fast track to improve our public yards. Some of that work the public yards do is going to have to go to the private yards. You're going to have to give them the money so they can invest in increasing capacity to provide that interim step so that you can maintain those submarines and nuclear aircraft carriers there. In the interim, they do the RCOHs, the comprehensive refueling and reconstruction. But the routine maintenance, I think some of that's going to have to be pushed over. Remember, we have limited capability even in our public yards. We have one dry dock in Norfolk, Dock 6, that does carrier work. We have one dock in Puget Sound, Dock 8, that can do carrier work, that it can actually accommodate the Ford-class carriers. So we're very, very limited in that scope. We're going to need to take down some of those dry docks for a period of time in order to rebuild them. That means these ships are going to have to go elsewhere for routine maintenance. So it means that Huntington Ingalls Industries is going to have to devote some of their workforce and time to that. The same with General Dynamics on submarines, some of those Virginia-class submarines. And we see the Boise that has now been out going on 5 years as it now goes through that maintenance availability. And listen, those private yards have to regain the muscle memory on what they used to do, which was to maintain these ships. So we're going to have to do that. And we're doing that in the face of Ford class coming on and needing to be repaired, in the face of Columbia class coming on. There's going to be a perfect storm of needed capacity that's not there today. If we're on the right track, listen, the 20-year SIOPS plan, I think, needs to be compressed to 10. I think you can do it in 10, but you can only do it in 10 if you make the necessary investments in private yards so they have the capacity as a bridge. And I would argue we need to keep that capacity, because that capacity is a national asset that helps us counter what we know is today's Chinese capacity. If we ever get into a conflict, to have the ability to turn these ships around quickly for maintenance, or to get those ones that are in the yard and maybe quickly get them to sea so we can surge in case of a conflict.
Could I two finger on that? Because that's a critical point. I mean, if you think back to the tragic collision in 2017, I believe it took more than 22 months to finish repairs on the Fitz due to limited shipyard capacity. And even worse, it took close to 4 years to repair the USS Boise, if memory serves. But you think about that, those delays occurred in peacetime. Imagine what the backlog is going to be like if the Chinese start punching holes in our hulls, right? I mean, that things get a lot more complicated in that scenario. So sorry to chime in. Representative Wittman raises a critical point.
No, and that brings up a great point. And the other thing that jumps out at me from that conversation is you need the proficiency to be able to do the kind of ship repair work. And I think that's one thing that we've seen with both General Dynamics and Huntington Ingalls, is that it's just a totally different job to repair an existing ship than to build a new one, because it's not as routinized. You have to build the work package from scratch every time. So there's also an element of this that we not only need to give them the infrastructure capacity to support it, but we probably need to give them the reliable level of work so that they can then build that, that proficiency, that set of workers that are skilled at doing the kind of repair work that's necessary, which is probably a different set of skills than they need to build the ship in the first place. So they need that demand signal that forces them to be able to have that set of workers set aside, which is a different strategy for how we do ship maintenance than we do it today, where we kind of just use them as the surge capacity. But we probably need to think of them as having, that's an element of our capacity we need to have consistently employed. So one thing, Congressman Gallagher, one thing that I was thinking too is the Coast Guard seems to have been missing from a lot of the conversation when it comes to the SHIPYARD Act and also with regard to the infrastructure plan writ large. And you sit on the committee over in the House that oversees the Coast Guard in part. So I was wondering, what were your thoughts on how we could try to improve the repair and building capacity that the shipyard or that the Coast Guard depends on?
Well, I had something called the Great Lakes Winter Commerce Act that I introduced, a bipartisan bill that would just simply codify the Coast Guard's mission on the Great Lakes. It's more of a parochial, or the Midwesterners will appreciate this, not just the East Coasters like Representative Wittman, who look at a far vaster expanse of water. But he's been up to visit good old Lake Michigan, so he'll understand the importance. But 20% of our nation's GDP is generated in the Great Lakes region, and our commerce suffers because of a lack of sufficient ice breaking. So part of what we need to do is build more icebreakers for the Coast Guard. Coast Guard plays a critical role in a variety of missions in our near abroad here, a lot of counter narcotics missions as well. I think we don't do enough thinking in terms of integrating the mission of the Coast Guard to what the U.S. Navy is trying to do, and really deconflicting those and thinking how we can sort of develop some synergies. And part of that reflects the committee structure and just the fact that the Coast Guard is part of DHS. And so that creates challenges, but that's something that, we're trying to prioritize on the Transportation Committee and in the infrastructure bill.
So as we're wrapping up here, Congressman Wittman, I wanted to ask you about about just this idea of growing the fleet. We've got a current bill, that's on the current proposed budget, that's on the Hill being considered right now. Is Congress looking at ways to force the Navy to try to grow the fleet? And one of the things the Navy has identified is O&S costs as a challenge. That's one of the reasons they're retiring these cruisers early. And that's one of the constraints they identified in their shipbuilding plan as, driving down the size of the fleet that they're moving toward. So the fleet that they've identified is going to have some pretty severe limitations, particularly in surface combatants and amphibious ships that we've talked about. How are you thinking about trying to get the Navy to grow the fleet? Are we looking at procurement and O&M increases? Are we looking at trying to get a clean sheet for structure assessment out of the Navy and then come up with different ways to resource it? What are some of your thoughts on how to do that?
Well, I think the House Armed Services Committee is going to have to track its own path for this year, because it's obvious that the Pentagon in the 30-year shipbuilding plan doesn't provide the granularity necessary. I think it's very insufficient. There's no real path forward for them other than way outside the fit up, which is what all dreams are made of. But I want to make sure we're focusing on what do we do as a bridge? What do we do this year? And it will be a combined effort. It will have to be, how do we increase the number of surface ships that we build? And even if you fund a DDG 51 Flight 3 this year, that ship's not going to be available except at the very end of the fit up. So as you're retiring these 7 CGs, and I've engaged with the CNO to say, you've got to retire them at a different rate. I understand the cost structure there. I understand wanting to invest in the future, but to dump this much capacity at one time, I think, is an unacceptable risk. I understand wanting to divest in those, but remember, the savings you accrue still are way out in the future. So the key is what do we do, first of all, to properly resource maintenance? What do we do to make sure we're level loading the yards? Because what's happened in the past is we've had this roller coaster ride where the yards are full. I mean, you ride by Norfolk and the Elizabeth River and you see every spot there, every dockside availability, every dry dock. The dry docks are doubled with destroyers in there being worked on. And then all of a sudden, 2 years from now, the yards will be empty. So you can't expect to have what you need in those yards if you don't level load them. So predictability, proper planning for maintenance, resourcing that maintenance, I believe that we can extend. And remember, we put a lot of money into some of these CGs and modernization, and now we're going to send them out the door. It just doesn't make good sense. Let's properly resource it. Again, we talked about workforce, got to have the workforce there. You have to level load those yards so that folks are knowledgeable about what goes on. You have to look at the contracting mechanism, the fixed cost versus variable cost, the MISMO versus MACMO. And then the elements of the Navy, like MARMAC, specifically MARMAC in our region, has to work with the ship maintenance elements to make sure that those things happen properly. That has not happened in our region. I argue that's the biggest impediment, is an ineffective MARMAC and what they've done to not allow ship maintenance to happen the way it needs to. Listen, MARMAC out of the West Coast has done a great job. For some reason, MARMAC there in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia is complacent and ineffective. Something's got to happen. Leadership has to step up in the Navy and say, no, MARMAC is going to be held accountable, and we have to make sure that those things get done. Short of that, we won't have the combined effort of building new ships and having an aggressive maintenance schedule for the ones we have.
I am glad you brought that up about the contracting mechanisms and the oversight, because those are complaints I get all the time from the ship repair industry, because it's challenging for them to have to be able to develop the capacity to do the ship repair that the Navy will need in the future, at the same time not knowing from one month to the next what their demand signal is going to be, so they know what to hire and know when they can make the capital investment. So coming up with new contracting mechanisms and overseeing contracts in a way that allows the shipyard to get its work done in an appropriate manner. Congressman Gallagher, what do you think in terms of like how can we grow the fleet while also addressing the challenge of O&S costs that the Navy has cited as one of their constraints?
Well, I know it's not going to be delivered this year, but I think we'd all agree that the frigate is absolutely essential it is a foundational element of the future fleet. And so getting that right, learning the right lessons from the LCS experience, making sure we have a stable design. I understand the need for combat system changes, but for HM&E in particular, making sure that's stable, we're minimizing changes. And that's, that's the promise of the FREM was that it's a proven design. Obviously, we have US standards. We're going to need to change some things, but to me, that's absolutely critical. Frigates can go places that other ships can't go, for that day-to-day deterrence, showing the flag. So though those ships aren't going to be delivered this year, I think there's a lot of work we can do this year to get that right and make sure that we're delivering on time and on budget. And, this is going to sound silly too. There's something simple I think needs to happen. And I've never seen it happen in my short time. I think we need just to get the CNO, the commandant, whoever else from the five-sided building, and then a few of us navalists in Congress together in a room, no cameras, have a map, and just in simple terms, have them walk through their theory of the case for what they think the PLA is trying to do, what we need to do to counter it, and just explain, here's what we can do right now, here's what we need to be able to do, and just equip us, invite us into the wargaming process a little bit so we can better advocate for the Navy on the Hill. That simple, I know that sounds stupid, but that simple conversation rarely happens. Instead, we kind of communicate in a hearing and, it's an imperfect format. So I'm an advocate for allowing some congressional participation in Navy wargaming this year.
That's an excellent idea. As we wrap up here, Congressman Wittman, do you have any closing remarks you want to make before we end here? Because I want to give you that chance to make sure we address anything that we failed to capture thus far.
Well, absolutely, Bryan. Listen, I want to thank you. Thanks for your leadership and your expertise and applying that to asking the tough questions about where we're going with this nation's military. I want to thank the Hudson Institute for hosting this. This is a great opportunity. I understand folks, want to know and hear more, especially as Representative Gallagher said, outside the committee hearing side. I mean, everybody gets 5 minutes. You ask your questions. A lot of that's scripted and canned. this is a much more candid conversation where we can get down into the details. I think one of the biggest challenges this nation is going to face going forward is how do we do the things we need to do to make sure that we continue to be a strategic player in the world and that we don't yield that ground to China. And listen, we're going through times where we're very divided, where attention is taking away from these critical strategic questions. My concern is the attention is being paid elsewhere. And as it is, the Chinese are plodding along in a very deliberative way and saying, when the chance is there, we'll take that opportunity. And the problem is if we get to a point where we cannot either deter them because they look at the delta being so great that they're going to take advantage of it, and then in a conflict where there's a quick and decisive action by them that causes us to back up and go, okay, we'll yield, then that will forever place the United States in a subservient position in the world. And I would argue at that particular point, the things that make us strong, which is the United States dollar being the world currency, and all those things that help us where we are today strategically, all go out the window. So, folks can talk about all this other stuff, all these domestic issues, but if we're not strong strategically, everything else implodes from that. Our nation's defense is the foundation for where this nation has been, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War to where we are today. If we capitulate and give up that position, the future for this nation is not what we all desire for it to be.
Well said. Well said. Thank you. Congressman Gallagher, any closing remarks before we wrap up?
There's not much I can add to that other than to tell a quick sea story about Representative Wittman. If you ever traveled with him, there's only one commandment that you cannot break, which is that you're not allowed to check a bag, because Wittman travels light, he travels fast, and it's all business. It's no fluff. And so that expeditionary mindset is not just something he preaches about on Capitol Hill. He lives it out in his day-to-day life. And I very much respect that.
Me too. That's great. That's how I'd like to travel too. Well, Congressman Mike Gallagher, Congressman Rob Wittman, thank you very much for being with us today. This was a fantastic conversation. Here's hoping that we can get the SHIPYARD Act and the broader Navy budget moving forward in a more positive direction. I appreciate your time, and good luck on this year's defense bill. And we'll be talking to you later. Thank you, everybody, for visiting with us at the Hudson Institute, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bryan.